Stars blinked out of existence. Entire civilizations fled in panic. Then Earth received the warning transmission. Admiral Jessica Kane's voice crackled across the void. "We have received your warnings. However, we will not be evacuating." Her chilling laugh echoed through the command center as she declared humanity's war footing. While the galaxy retreated, we prepared to hunt. The peace shattered when the obsidian seal gave way. No one knew what civilization built that prison, or what they feared enough to create a containment field that wasn't a structure at all, but a rift in the fabric of existence. It was a scar in reality, and when it tore open, things came through that shouldn't exist. They were not life as we know it. They were not even matter. They moved in the gaps between physics and the silent places where light and logic break down. These entities didn't attack. They didn't conquer. They simply erased. Stars didn't explode. They vanished, replaced by perfect absolute voids, spheres of nothing where solar systems had been. No light, no energy, no trace, just perfect silent negation. The Galactic Council's long-range observers had 300 cycles of records. They had logs of supernovae, black hole mergers, ancient wars that scorched galaxies. But this was different. This was an ending with no cause and no aftermath. Every civilization with deep space monitoring recognized it at once. They saw the pattern. A system goes dark, then another 3 sectors away, then 3 more in a line. This wasn't an invasion. It was an unbuilding, a deletion. The response was unanimous, instinctive, and immediate. Retreat. Evacuation orders flashed across comm networks. Thousands of worlds began moving populations, recalling fleets, sealing borders. Panic was not the word. It was resignation, they knew. You do not fight something that unmakes suns. You do not stand against a force that treats reality like a mistake to be corrected. The only rational move was to fall back, to put distance between your civilization and the spreading silence. Whole species began migrating coreward, abandoning generations of colonization in favor of survival. It was the greatest mass evacuation in recorded history, and it was happening in near total silence because what was there to say? Then one signal cut through the noise. Not a distress call, not a request for aid. A transmission from a system that hadn't even begun to evacuate. A signal from Sol. The transmission arrived on a priority channel, monitored by every emergency coordination center still operational. It wasn't encoded. It wasn't scrambled. It was meant to be heard. Admiral Jessica Kane's voice cut through the static with a clarity that seemed almost offensive amid the chaos. There was no panic in her tone, no hesitation. Just a flat, even cadence that carried more weight than any distress call. She acknowledged the galactic warnings. She confirmed they understood the threat. Then she delivered the line that would echo across 1,000 command decks. "We will not be evacuating." This was not a request for clarification. It was a statement of fact. Protocol demanded immediate strategic withdrawal. Standard procedure called for the preservation of biological and cultural data. Every other species was executing these steps with grim efficiency. Humanity's response was a complete inversion of established survival doctrine. Admiral Kane followed her declaration with a set of orders that redefined the word response. She announced the immediate conversion of Earth's entire industrial and societal infrastructure to a total war footing. Not a defensive posture, not a shield, a spear. The transmission cut after 19 seconds. The final sound wasn't a formal sign-off. It was a low, sharp laugh. It wasn't a sound of madness. It was the sound of anticipation, of a challenge accepted. Across the galaxy, tactical analysts and political leaders replayed the message. They checked their translations. They ran diagnostic on the signal integrity. The words were clear. The meaning was incomprehensible. To a civilization facing existential deletion, the only sane reaction was flight. To humanity, it was an invitation. This was not the cry of a cornered animal. It was the calm assessment of a predator that had just identified a worthy opponent. While evacuation fleets burned hard for the galactic core, human command networks lit up with a different kind of traffic. They weren't plotting escape vectors. They were exchanging targeting solutions. They weren't debating which colonies to abandon. They were calculating engagement ranges and weapon yields against a non-corporeal enemy. Their sensors, pointed at the encroaching voids, weren't measuring the scale of the threat for avoidance. They were gathering data for a counterattack. The galactic consensus was unanimous. Humanity had lost its collective mind. They were staring into the abyss, and instead of flinching, they were measuring it for depth. Rational species protect what they have. They retreat to fight another day. Humanity's calculus was different. They saw the unbuilding of reality not as an end, but as a problem. A complex, dangerous, fascinating problem. And humanity's response to a problem, historically, is to break it down into parts, understand its mechanics, and then break it completely. The laugh at the end of that transmission wasn't hysteria. It was the beginning of the hunt. The void spawn triggered a fundamental rewiring of human psychology. Where other species saw an apocalypse, humanity's leadership saw a catalyst. They didn't broadcast messages of reassurance or final prayers. They delivered a call to action framed in the language of opportunity. The global address from President Webb didn't speak of survival. He spoke of a test, a final ultimate test of human ingenuity and resolve. He called the void spawn a worthy opponent, a phrase that echoed through media channels, transforming a nameless dread into a defined adversary. This rhetorical shift was deliberate and pervasive. General Hayes appeared before the Global Assembly and stated that the entities had, for the first time, given all of humanity a single, common enemy. She framed millennia of internal division and conflict as mere preparation for this moment. The enemy was no longer each other. The enemy was the silent, star-killing anomaly at the edge of their system. This wasn't a speech of fear. It was a recruitment drive. It turned existential terror into a unifying national project, a shared purpose on a planetary scale. In the scientific community, the reaction was even more stark. Dr. Vasquez's leaked memorandum to the Global Science Directorate didn't request emergency funding for shields or evacuation. It proposed the largest research initiative in human history. She outlined the potential to advance theoretical physics by millennia, to unlock secrets of dimensional mechanics and reality stabilization that had been pure conjecture just weeks before. The entities weren't just a threat. They were a walking, breathing, if that was the word, laboratory of exotic physics. The chance to study them was a siren call the scientific community could not ignore. This collective psychological pivot had a tangible, immediate effect on the population. Fear didn't vanish. It was channeled. The anxiety of impending doom was converted into the frantic energy of construction. The despair of a dying star was forged into the determination to build a bigger gun. People didn't hide. They reported to work. They retrained. They volunteered. The societal response was not to preserve what was, but to build what was needed. This was the key that unlocked humanity's industrial might. They weren't fighting for their lives out of desperation. They were fighting for the challenge. Captain Morrison's now famous statement to his crew encapsulated this new risk calculus. He didn't promise to protect them. He didn't vow a heroic last stand. He looked at the sensor readouts showing the approaching void and promised his team they would hunt it down. He said they would make the encounter so memorable, the entity would regret leaving its prison. This was not a defensive posture. It was an offensive mindset applied to an existential threat. The boundary between rational self-preservation and provocative aggression had been erased. Humanity was no longer calculating odds of survival. They were calculating angles of attack. The psychology of the prey had been utterly discarded, replaced by the cold, focused psyche of the hunter. The galaxy was retreating. Humanity was leaning forward. A planet becomes a weapon by ceasing to be a home. The process is not about building new things as much as it is about repurposing everything that already exists. Earth's governments issued a single global directive. They suspended all non-essential services. Schools closed. Entertainment networks went dark. Sports arenas and concert halls fell silent. The entire cultural and educational apparatus of a world simply stopped. The energy that once powered those systems was diverted. The people who operated them were reassigned. This was not a temporary measure. It was a permanent shift in priorities until the threat was neutralized. Every civilian vessel in near orbit and beyond received new orders. They were not to return to port for decommissioning. They were to report to the nearest naval yard for immediate retrofit. Passenger liners with capacity for thousands had their luxury suites stripped out. Their hulls were reinforced. Their power cores were modified to feed energy weapon mounts welded to their external frames. Cargo haulers, once loaded with commercial goods, had their vast holds converted into magazine space for kinetic launch systems. Their navigation computers were overwritten with tactical targeting software. The transformation of these ships was not gentle. It was brutal, efficient, and fast. What took weeks in simulation was done in days on the ground. The civilian infrastructure on the surface underwent the same violent conversion. Automotive factories that once produced ground cars now fabricated armored vehicle parts. Microelectronics plants shifted from consumer devices to guidance system components. Chemical processing facilities stopped making fertilizers and plastics and began compounding high-yield explosives and propellants. The global economy, a complex and delicate system of supply and demand, was manually overridden. It became a single focused circuit with one output: war material. The production tempo that resulted defied all known galactic economic models. It was not sustainable. It was not designed to be. It was designed to achieve maximum output in a minimal window. The output was staggering. In a span of just 3 weeks, the orbital shipyards around Mars and Luna launched more new construction warships than most spacefaring civilizations produce in a standard century. These were not elegant, tested designs. They were functional, brutalist platforms built around overwhelming firepower and redundant systems. Crucibles ran day and night forging armor plate. Assembly lines moved at a pace that risked structural flaws, accepting the trade-off for speed. The boundary between theoretical science and applied weaponization dissolved completely. Research and development teams worked directly with naval engineers on the factory floors. Prototype weapons moved from simulation to production in hours, not years. The result was not just a planet on a war footing. It was a planet that had become a weapon. The distinction between military and civilian evaporated. A farmer driving a tractor one day could be operating a fabricator in an underground munitions plant the next. The entire population, the industrial base, the energy grid, the transport networks, all of it was integrated into a single system with a single purpose. Earth was no longer a place of cities and cultures. It was a consolidated manufacturing and deployment hub, a planet-sized weapons complex that had turned its entire being toward the act of hunting. The galaxy was still measuring the scale of the threat. Humanity was already measuring the capacity of its new forges. The solar flare project didn't start as a weapon. It began as a physicist's calculated gamble. Dr. Elena Vasquez presented it not to the military command, but to a joint session of the Applied Astrophysics Council. Her proposal was simple in concept, insane in execution. They would weaponize Sol. The star that gave life to their system would become their primary artillery piece. The council listened in a silence that grew heavier with each slide. This was not a plan for defense. It was a plan to turn their sun into a gun. The engineering challenge was unprecedented. It required placing gravity manipulation generators directly into the sun's corona. These devices, forged from materials theorized only weeks earlier, had to withstand temperatures and pressures that vaporized matter. They were not designed to contain the star's energy, but to direct it, to pinch and twist the sun's own magnetic fields, creating artificial channels through the plasma. The goal was to trigger a controlled, directed solar flare, a lance of stellar matter and energy that could be aimed. The project teams called them sun spears. The risks were not theoretical. A miscalculation in the gravitational lensing could destabilize the star's fusion process. An error in the magnetic containment could trigger a coronal mass ejection of catastrophic scale, wiping out the inner planets instead of the enemy. The systems had a projected failure rate that would have shut down any conventional project. Galactic observers monitoring the installations deemed the technological risk profile unacceptable. No insurance model could cover it. No ethical framework could approve it. It was the kind of project that ended civilizations. Human physicists approved it anyway. They didn't dismiss the risks. They accepted them as a necessary variable in a larger equation. Their calculations for the flare trajectories were models of terrifying precision. They accounted for solar rotation, plasma flow dynamics, and gravitational lensing across millions of kilometers of space. They were not aiming a weapon. They were conducting a stellar-scale physics experiment with their entire solar system as the laboratory. The potential payoff, a weapon that could erase a void spawn with the raw output of a star, outweighed the existential threat of accidentally destroying themselves. Installation crews worked in shifts, protected by ships whose shields glowed white-hot at close approach. They anchored the massive generators at precise Lagrange points within the corona, their outlines shimmering like mirages in the intense heat. Each successful emplacement was a minor victory against physics itself. The network grew, a ring of impossible machines circling a star, silent and waiting. The command to activate would not come from a military officer. It would come from a physicist at a console, reviewing the final calculations one more time. The day the system came online, there was no ceremony. A void spawn signature had been detected on an approach vector toward Mercury. The order was given. Across the network, generators activated. On screens across the system, astronomers watched as magnetic field lines on the sun's surface began to warp. They converged, tightening into a focused knot of energy. Then the sun itself seemed to reach out. A tendril of plasma hotter than a million stars lashed out across the void. It didn't explode. It traveled. A coherent beam of stellar death precisely aimed. It struck the void spawn not as an explosion but as a continuous cutting stream. The entity didn't vanish. It was unmade by a force greater than nothingness, a star's fury focused to a point. Sol was no longer just their sun. It was their first and greatest cannon. Humanity's greatest strategic advantage against the void spawn was not superior technology. It was a willingness to operate from a position of profound ignorance. They built and deployed systems based on effects they observed, not principles they understood. This approach ran counter to all established scientific and military doctrine. You test a theory, you validate a hypothesis. You do not weaponize a phenomenon because it worked once in a lab. Humanity did exactly that. They embraced the unknown not as a barrier but as a tool. The reality anchors were the first example. The science teams observed that void spawn caused localized reality decay. Their presence made physics unstable. Matter unraveled. Energy dissipated. The human response was not to study why this happened. It was to build a machine that made it stop. The anchors generated a field that enforced a bubble of normal physics. They didn't know how the field worked. They only knew that within its radius a void spawn could not unmake things. The devices were hastily constructed, poorly shielded and powered by jury-rigged reactors. But they held the line. They created pockets of stable space where human ships could fight. Then came the paradox engines. These devices weaponized quantum uncertainty. They didn't fire missiles or energy beams. They fired contradictory states of being. A target would be hit with a wave of probability that forced it to simultaneously exist and not exist. The effect was violently unstable. The science team lead admitted in her log that the operating principle was statistical violence. They were not sure if they were overloading the target's coherence or simply offending the universe itself. The engines frequently broke down. Sometimes they backfired. But when they worked, they could shatter a Class II void spawn into dissipating fragments. Perhaps the most audacious application was the Mirror Dimension project. Humans discovered they could briefly open windows into adjacent empty realities. They couldn't control what was on the other side. They didn't know the long-term consequences of tearing holes between dimensions, but they saw a tactical use. They began luring void spawn into these pockets of null space and then sealing the entrance behind them. It was the ultimate containment solution. Trap the horror in a reality where there was nothing left to unmake. The project was filed under high-risk experimental tactics. The success rate was low. The potential payoff was immense. Dr. Margaret Foster's now infamous testimony to the Oversight Committee captured this philosophy perfectly. She stated bluntly that her teams did not understand the fundamental mechanics of any of these systems. They knew how to build them. They knew what buttons to press. They had observed consistent cause and effect. But the underlying why remained a mystery. This admission would have ended any research project in a conventional civilization. For humanity, it was the project's greatest strength. Their ignorance created a strategic blind spot their enemies could not predict. The void spawn operated on rules humanity did not know, so humanity made new rules. This became their most potent weapon. They turned the uncertainty of the battlefield into a space they could control through sheer force of experimentation. A senior analyst from a neutral observer species noted the profound irony. The humans had weaponized the very act of understanding. They weren't fighting the enemy with better versions of known science. They were fighting by writing a completely new set of physical laws, one desperate field test at a time. They engaged the unknowable not with answers but with better questions. The question was always the same. What happens if we try this? The answer was usually explosive. The strategy shift was announced with a call sign that defied all tactical naming conventions. Protocol Poke the Bear. It was not a defensive measure. It was an act of deliberate, calculated provocation. A single science vessel, the Curious Mind, received orders to close to within 5 kilometers of a Class 3 void spawn. Its mission was not to engage, not to harass. Its mission was to observe, to get close, to see what happened. The ship's captain read the orders twice. Then he plotted the approach vector. His crew did not question it. They powered down their minimal defensive systems and activated every sensor array they had. They moved in slowly. The void spawn filled their viewports. It wasn't a ship or a creature. It was a distortion, a patch of starless black that seemed to drink the light from their screens. Standard doctrine for every other species was to maintain a minimum safe distance of several astronomical units. The Curious Mind crossed that line without slowing. Then it crossed the next, and the next. Kilometers became meaningless. They were close enough to see the subtle shifts in the anomaly's surface, close enough to feel their own instrumentation strain against the localized reality decay. The bridge was silent except for the low hum of active sensors and the calm voice of the science officer calling out data streams. Energy signatures spiked. Spatial distortions intensified around their hull. The entity was aware of them. It was reacting to their presence. This was the entire point of the protocol, to force a reaction, to record the response. They weren't firing weapons. They were firing questions made of focused scan pulses. Every fluctuation in the void spawn's energy field was logged. Every shift in its dimensional frequency was analyzed in real time. On the command deck of the orbiting carrier, Admiral Kane watched the data feed. She wasn't looking for a weakness. She was looking for a pattern, a rhythm, a behavior they could predict. The science teams theorized that the entities operated on a set of rules, however alien. The goal was to learn those rules by breaking them, by intruding, by poking it. The protocol was a masterpiece of analytical aggression. It treated the most feared entity in the galaxy not as a god or a demon, but as a complex system to be reverse-engineered through stress testing. The data confirmed a critical hypothesis. The void spawn's own physics could be turned against it. Its method of erasing reality created a predictable echo in localized spacetime, a ripple of stability in the immediate wake of its destructive wave. The reality anchors they had built worked by amplifying that echo, creating a bubble of enforced normal physics. The Curious Mind sensors confirmed the effect. They weren't just observing the enemy. They were learning its language. They were mapping the holes in its own defenses. This approach completely inverted the standard model of engagement. It replaced reflexive defense with research-driven offense. The primary objective was no longer to destroy the target. It was to capture data, to acquire a sample. Every close pass by a science vessel was a tactical maneuver. Every sensor reading was a piece of battlefield intelligence more valuable than a volley of missiles. The hunters were not soldiers. They were technicians. The weapon was not a gun. It was a scanner array. They were dissecting their prey while it was still alive and operating. The success of the protocol was not measured in debris fields. It was measured in terabytes of structural analysis and energy profiling. The culmination came when a follow-up mission, the Determined, used the data from the Curious Mind to position a series of reality anchors in a precise lattice around another Class 3. They triggered the anchors simultaneously. The void spawn's distortion field collapsed. For a fraction of a second it was pinned, contained. A specialized containment pod was launched. It captured the stabilized entity and sealed it inside a field of its own reflected physics. The capture was clean, efficient. A Class 3 cosmic horror was now a laboratory specimen. The transmission from the Determined was a simple 2-word update to Fleet Command. Bear poked. The implication was clear. Humanity had not conquered its fear. It had operationalized it. They had turned the paralyzing dread of the unknown into a systematic hunting methodology. Fear was no longer an emotion to be suppressed. It was a resource to be harvested. The galaxy hid from what it did not understand. Humanity reached out and grabbed it by the throat. The containment field hummed at a frequency that hurt the ears. It wasn't a cage of metal or energy. It was a box made of borrowed physics. The void spawn inside was not still. It pressed against the barriers, testing them. It was a patch of absolute black that seemed to swallow the light from the lab's overhead lamps. The field held. It did not bend. It did not flicker. The entity's primary weapon was the ability to make local reality cease to obey its own rules. The human field generators countered by enforcing a stricter set of rules. They created a pocket of space-time so stable, so rigidly defined, that the entity's influence simply broke against it. It was like trying to erase a word written in stone by blinking at it. This was the critical proof. The void spawn could not affect stabilized local spacetime. Their power had limits. They were not all-powerful. They were bound by a logic, however alien. The containment team, suited in hazard gear that was mostly guesswork, watched their readings. The entity's energy signatures spiked and fell. Its form shifted, trying to find a weakness in the field that wasn't there. It was frustrated. That was the first human observation. The thing exhibited something analogous to frustration. This was data. This was gold. The decision to bring it aboard the research vessel was not made lightly. Protocols for this scenario did not exist. They were written in real time. The containment pod was moved from the catcher craft into the main lab bay. Magnetic clamps locked it into a secondary stabilization frame. Scientists surrounded it. They did not look at the thing itself for long. They looked at their screens. They studied the readouts of its emissions, its mass fluctuations, its distortion field intensity. They had turned cosmic horror into a laboratory subject. It was no longer a monster from the void. It was Specimen X1. Galactic observers on secure channels watched the data stream. Their own histories spoke of ancient civilizations that tried to fight these entities. They built great fortresses. They forged impenetrable shields. They all failed. Their records described the void spawn as unstoppable, a force of nature that could not be opposed, only avoided. Humanity's approach had been different. They did not try to build a stronger wall. They built a better key. They did not meet force with force. They met paradox with a more interesting paradox. The observers did not cheer. They were silent. A silence born not of awe, but of a deep, unsettling reassessment of the universe's balance of power. The specimen became the key to everything. Xenobiology teams that had spent their careers studying carbon-based life forms now adjusted their scanners to read reality fractures. They took tissue samples. The term was a misnomer. There was no tissue. They extracted minute particles of whatever the entity was composed of, pulling them through microscopic ports in the containment field. The samples were not stable outside the field. They degraded quickly, but not before yielding terabytes of data on quantum signature and dimensional resonance. Energy signatures were mapped across a spectrum no one had ever needed to measure before. Every scan, every probe, every attempted interaction was systematically logged and cross-referenced. The goal was not just to understand how to kill it. The goal was to understand how it lived, how it moved, how it perceived. The data from the living specimen was integrated with the battlefield reports from hunter teams. Patterns emerged. Weaknesses became visible. Strategies could be refined. The entity in the lab was no longer a threat. It was a teacher, a violently unwilling reality-bending teacher, but a teacher nonetheless. Humanity had done the one thing the galaxy thought impossible. They had not only captured a void spawn, they had put it on a table and begun to take it apart. The act of containment was not the end of the fight. It was the beginning of the dissection. The rate of technological adaptation was not evolution. It was revolution on a stopwatch. The data from the captured specimen did not go to an archive. It went directly to fabrication plants. Dr. Foster's team bypassed peer review. They bypassed safety testing. They moved from theoretical models to working prototypes in a time frame that broke every research and development record. The process was not clean. It was brutal and efficient. They identified a usable principle from the scans, drafted a weapon design around it, and fired up the forges. Failure was not a setback. It was data for the next iteration. The first deployable systems were not elegant. They were functional. Reality-anchoring weapons emerged from the workshops. These were not defensive devices anymore. They were projectors mounted on warship hulls. They fired focused beams of stabilized spacetime. A hit did not destroy a target. It locked it in place, making it vulnerable to conventional weapons. Dimensional phase shifters followed. These devices could briefly shift a target a fraction of a second out of phase with local reality. The effect was temporary but disorienting. It broke the target's coherence, creating a window for attack. These weapons were not built for finesse. They were built for battlefield results. Admiral Kane reviewed the initial field reports. She did not praise the breakthroughs. She noted the potential for more efficient implementations. Her feedback was not about celebration. It was about refinement. Reduce the power drain on the phase shifters. Increase the effective range of the reality projectors. Streamline the control interfaces for combat conditions. Her comments were forwarded to the fabrication teams. They adjusted the designs between production runs. The pipeline from captured data to mass-produced technology was not a line. It was a loop constantly tightening. The speed of this loop defied comprehension. From the moment a new data set was extracted from the specimen, to the moment the first production model of a weapon based on that data rolled off the assembly line took approximately 18 hours. This pace was not just faster than current galactic powers. It was faster than the legendary industrial outputs described in the histories of ancient, long-vanished empires. Those civilizations took centuries to develop new technologies. Humanity did it between shifts. This was not merely rapid development. It was a fundamental redefinition of technological progress under threat. Humans were not just fighting the void spawn. They were co-opting their toolkit. They studied how the entities unraveled physics and built devices that enforced it. They analyzed how the spawn shifted between dimensions and built weapons that could knock them out of phase. They were using the enemy's own capabilities against them. The prey's greatest strengths were being systematically identified, isolated, and reverse-engineered into deployable military assets. A void spawn's ability to negate matter became a human weapon that could negate a void spawn's coherence. This reversal was complete. The terrifying reality-erasing horror from beyond the stars was no longer the hunter. It was the source of parts. Its biological and energetic signatures were disassembled into components. Those components were cataloged, understood on a functional level, and reassembled into new configurations. Configurations that served human purposes. The predator's claws were removed, sharpened on a grinding wheel, and fitted to the predator's own rifle. The balance of power did not just shift, it inverted. Humanity was no longer fighting an enemy with superior technology. They were fighting an enemy whose technology they were actively stealing and improving. The things that made the void spawn unstoppable were the very things that made them vulnerable to a species that refused to be prey. The battlefield was no longer a region of space. It was a series of layers, a stack of realities where the void spawn moved between them like sharks through deep water. Hunting them required following. Earth's expeditionary force deployed not as a fleet but as a net. Thousands of vessels fanned out across known space and into the theoretical spaces adjacent to it. This was not an armada of warships alone. It was a combined force. Retrofitted cargo haulers acted as mobile command and supply hubs. Science vessels served as advanced sensor platforms. Hunter-killer craft, sleek and loaded with newly forged dimensional weapons, formed the sharp end of the spear. Their coordination was not just tactical. It was symphonic. Every ship had a role. Every role supported the hunt. They tracked the entities not by energy signature or mass, but by the subtle tears they left in the fabric of reality. A void spawn moving from one dimension to another created a ripple, a distortion in the quantum foam. Human sensors refined by data from the captive specimen could now detect these ripples. They could plot a course through the instability. The hunter teams didn't just pursue, they navigated. They slipped into the gaps between worlds, following trails that were invisible to any other species. The pursuit was conducted across a landscape that was fundamentally unstable. A hunter-killer might engage its target in a reality where physics was slightly different, where light bent the wrong way, or time flowed at an inconsistent rate. The key to this pursuit was the predator variants. These were human-built systems based on captured void spawn abilities. Phase shift emulators allowed human ships to briefly synchronize with the target's dimensional frequency. Reality ripple projectors could create false trails or force a spawn back into a preferred dimension for engagement. Humans were not just using the enemy's technology. They were using the enemy's inherent abilities, replicated and refined. They had become mimics of the very horror they hunted. This changed the strategic goal completely. The directive was no longer to defend a line or protect a world. It was to hunt and eradicate, to find every void spawn and remove it. The strategy was cleansing, systematic, absolute. Human strikes occurred at the weak points. They engaged where reality itself was malleable, at the dimensional boundaries the spawn used for transit. An attack might begin in one reality, force the target to phase shift to escape, and have a second hunter team waiting for it in the next. They used the enemy's own mobility against it. This offensive concept redefined interstellar warfare. Battles were no longer fought over territory or resources. They were fought over the fundamental laws of existence. Victory was measured in stabilized spacetime and a confirmed termination. They became apex predators in a multi-dimensional ecosystem. The void spawn were no longer the top of the food chain. They were prey that had wandered into the wrong hunting ground. A human hunter-killer team, emerging from a dimensional rift to corner a Class 4 spawn, was a new fact of the universe. The scale was cosmic. The hunt spanned light years and layered realities. The entity that had once made stars cease to exist was now the one being pursued, the one being cornered, the one being unmade. The hunters had become the hunted, and humanity had written the new rules of the chase. The galaxy watched as ships that were once freighters now danced through the cracks in creation, their holds empty of cargo, their bays full of weapons designed to cage the night. The incursion alert for Vega Sector flashed across tactical displays. A pack of Class 4 void spawn transitioned into local space. They weren't drifting. They were moving with intent, on a vector toward the Zilani Confederation's primary colony world. The Zilani had the best cloaking technology in their region of space. Their ships could hide from most sensors. Their planetary shields were advanced. None of it mattered. The void spawn didn't use sensors that could be fooled by light-bending fields. They perceived the instability in reality caused by the concentrated energy of a civilization. The colony was a beacon to them. Human hunter teams were already on station. They weren't waiting for a formal request for aid. The network of reality anchor listening posts had detected the dimensional ripples of the spawn's approach minutes before they materialized. 3 hunter-killer groups moved to intercept. They didn't form a defensive line. They executed a pincer maneuver, cutting off the spawn's advance and potential escape routes back into the dimensional layers. The engagement began not with a declaration, but with the activation of targeting scanners. The weapons they deployed were not the first-generation systems from the early days of the war. These were the refined models. Mark IV reality projectors fired pulses of stabilized space that forced the spawn to coalesce into a defined form. Improved phase shift emulators synchronized with the entity's dimensional frequency, locking them into a single plane of reality. The human ships didn't fire explosive munitions. They fired focused beams of counter-physics. A Class 4's primary defense was its ability to make attacks simply cease to exist upon contact. The human weapons were designed to exist harder. The neutralization was clinical. It was not a battle. It was a procedure. 14 minutes after the first spawn materialized, the last one was terminated. The entire pack was gone. Their eerie distortions in space snapped back to normal physics with a silent, violent pop. The area was clear. The Zilani colony had not even finished raising its planetary shields. Their command center was still receiving conflicting sensor reports when the human team signaled the all-clear. The operation did not end with the kill. It entered its second phase. Specialist vessels moved into the engagement area. Their task was recovery and analysis. They deployed delicate sensor arrays to capture the fading energy signatures of the terminated entities. They used tractor beams to collect particulate matter, the dissipating remains of whatever the spawn were made of. Every fragment, every energy echo was logged and stored. This systematic collection of data was as important as the kill itself. Each engagement refined their understanding. Each sample improved their weapons. A Zilani observation post hidden behind its advanced cloaking technology recorded the entire event. Their sensors were unable to get a clear lock on the void spawn themselves, but they clearly tracked the human vessels. They saw the precise coordination. They saw the efficiency of the weapons. They saw the methodical cleanup operation that followed. The most unnerving part was the timeline. 14 minutes. From first contact to total eradication and evidence collection. The Zilani had warships that could engage in battles lasting days. This was something else. This was pest control on a cosmic scale. This 14-minute engagement became the standard. The human hunting pattern was now a disciplined, repeatable formula. Locate the target through predictive dimensional tracking. Engage with overwhelming, tailored counter-physics. Extract all possible data and material from the aftermath. They were not just fighting the void spawn. They were farming them. Each engagement yielded new information. Each piece of information led to a minor tweak in weapon design, a slight improvement in sensor sensitivity, a more efficient containment protocol. They were refining their tools with every kill, turning the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known into a resource for their own evolution. The hunt was no longer a struggle for survival. It was a process of systematic improvement. The reality anchors arrived uninvited. Human engineering teams appeared in orbit around allied worlds without formal requests or treaties. They didn't ask for permission to deploy their dimensional protection systems. They informed local governments of the deployment schedule. Their approach was not diplomatic. It was logistical. The stated purpose was defense. The underlying message was control. The anchors were massive structures, forged from exotic alloys and humming with contained power. They were planted at strategic points around a planet, often in remote locations or unstable orbital zones. Their installation was swift, efficient, and completely unilateral. These devices generated a planetary-scale bubble of stabilized reality. Within this field, a void spawn could not manifest its primary weapon. It could not unmake local physics. The protection was absolute. A world under the umbrella of a human reality anchor was safe from the cosmic horror that was devouring the galaxy. The gift was undeniable. The method of its delivery was unnerving. The human teams did not linger for celebrations or explanations. They deployed the anchors, ran diagnostic checks, and moved to the next system on their list. They were not guests. They were installers. The demonstration of this power was a quiet affair on the diplomatic circuit. A human attaché invited to a secure meeting on a protected world was stopped by a reinforced blast door. The local security protocol required a lengthy identity verification. The human representative did not wait. He activated a personal phase shifter and simply walked through the wall. He reappeared inside the sealed chamber. The device was a miniaturized version of the technology in the anchors. It could bypass any physical security that relied on conventional matter. The act was not meant as a threat. It was a simple display of practicality, but the message was received. The humans could walk through walls. Their gifts came with unstated capabilities. Some civilizations panicked. Their governments issued frantic protests through official channels. They spoke of violations of sovereignty. They cited interstellar law and the right to self-determination. They argued that a defensive system imposed without consent was itself an act of aggression. The protests were noted by human diplomatic corps. They were not acted upon. The installation teams did not slow their pace. The reality was that the protests were theoretical. The voidspawn were not. The choice was not between freedom and submission. It was between accepting a human-made shield or facing absolute erasure alone. Panic was a luxury no one could afford. They accepted the gifts. Every world, after the initial shock, acquiesced. The practical necessity outweighed the abstract principle. Their populations demanded protection. Their leaders, facing certain extinction, signed the agreements placed before them. The agreements were not complex. They granted humanity operational control over the planetary defense grid and unrestricted access to local space. The terms were non-negotiable. The alternative was being left off the deployment list. No civilization chose to be left off the list. This created a deep and complex moral tension across Allied space. Sovereignty had been redefined. A planet's right to control its own security had been made conditional on humanity's assessment of the threat. Earth's power to protect also became its power to dominate. The reality anchors were not just shields. They were statements. They declared that humanity would decide what safety looked like, and they would implement it on their own terms. The protected worlds were safe from the void spawn. They were also, now fundamentally dependent on, and subject to, their human protectors. Questions began to emerge in galactic forums. What were the limits of this protection? What responsibility did humanity have to the civilizations it had made dependent? Where did defensive intervention end and imperial control begin? There were no clear answers. The old rules of galactic engagement, built over millennia of diplomacy between relative equals, no longer applied. A new power had emerged that operated on a different scale and a different moral calculus. Humanity was not just fighting a war. It was rewriting the entire concept of galactic protection. It was drawing new lines on the map of power, and those lines all originated from Earth. This created a new kind of fear, one that was quieter and more persistent than the terror of the void spawn. It was the fear of a savior who could not be reasoned with, a protector who answered to no authority but its own. The anchors hummed on, holding reality stable. They were a promise of safety. They were also a monument to the fact that the rules had changed. The galaxy had a new guardian, and that guardian did not ask for permission. The fear shifted. It detached from the void spawn and reattached itself to the humans. Civilizations watched their saviors and felt a deep, chilling unease. The effectiveness was the problem. It was too complete, too absolute. The void spawn were a force of nature, an unstoppable storm. Humanity was a scalpel. They did not weather the storm, they dissected it. They turned a universal ending into a solvable problem. The speed and precision of their response were not comforting. They were terrifying. A species that could do that was a species without limits. A species without limits is the most dangerous thing in the universe. Their technological progression was not a curve. It was a vertical line. They went from primitive, planetary defense to multi-dimensional warfare in a time frame that broke every model of development. Ancient galactic powers had taken millennia to achieve similar leaps. Humanity did it in weeks. They didn't slowly advance through stages of understanding. They leaped. They built devices based on principles they admitted they did not fully grasp. They weaponized ignorance itself. This defiance of all known scientific process was more alarming than any weapon they built. It suggested a mindset that saw rules as suggestions. Reality was not a law to be obeyed. It was a medium to be manipulated. The scale of their intervention removed any remaining comfort. They did not send a fleet. They converted their entire civilization into a single military asset. Then they began converting others. The reality anchors were implanted across sovereign worlds without debate. The protection was undeniable. The implication was stark. Humanity had appointed itself the guardian of the galaxy. It made the decision unilaterally. It enforced its will unilaterally. The protected worlds were safe. They were also no longer in control of their own security. Their safety was a gift from Earth, a gift that could presumably be rescinded. The willingness to accept collateral damage was perhaps the most disturbing trait. The Solar Flare Project risked extinguishing their own sun to create a weapon. They launched science vessels on suicide missions to gather data. Their entire strategy was built on a foundation of radical experimentation with reality itself. They did not see a star system as a home to be preserved at all costs. They saw it as a resource to be used. This calculus was alien to every other civilization. It painted a picture of a species that valued victory over preservation, understanding over safety. A species that would risk everything to win. They were no longer the upstart race from the Sol system. They were the apex predator. The transformation was total. The philosophy that enabled it was simple and unsettling. Every problem, no matter how existential, was an opportunity for aggressive inquiry. A challenge to be met with radical experimentation. A thing to be taken apart and understood. This mindset, applied to cosmic threats, reshaped the balance of power completely. The old galactic order, built on gradual progress and careful diplomacy, was obsolete. Humanity's greatest weapon was not a device. It was their approach to knowledge. They did not hoard it. They did not protect it. They weaponized it. They turned understanding into a tactical advantage. They treated the unknown not as a barrier, but as a weapon to be forged. This marked the true dawn of a new era, an era where the greatest threat was not the unknowable horror from beyond. It was the species that refused to be horrified, the species that saw the end of everything and decided to conduct an experiment. The galaxy had prayed for a savior. It had gotten one. And now, watching their saviors work, a new fear took root. The fear of the protector who answers to no one. The fear of the surgeon who is fascinated by the disease. They had been saved from the void. Now they lived in the shadow of their saviors. And the shadow was growing longer. The transmission was brief. It contained no celebration, no victory parade. It was a simple, factual report from Earth's unified command to the Galactic Council. The void spawn crisis was declared over. The threat was neutralized. The next sentence did not follow standard diplomatic language. It did not speak of peace or reconstruction. It stated that the human era had begun. This was not a prediction. It was an announcement. The document was signed, sealed, and distributed across all channels. An age had ended. A new one started with a line of text. Earth did not stand down. It consolidated. The massive industrial conversion to war footing did not reverse. It shifted focus. Post-crisis debriefings were not about demobilization. They were about integration. Human engineers and diplomats began arriving on formerly protected worlds. They came with schematics, not weapons. They offered to weave the new technology, the reality anchors, the phase shifters, the quantum stabilizers, into the very fabric of Allied infrastructure. The offer was not a request. It was the next phase of the project. The technology that had saved them would now define them. This was not mere resilience. Other species were resilient. They could endure, rebuild, and remember. Humanity was something else. They were rule renegotiating. They had taken the established laws of galactic engagement, the very principles of physics and diplomacy, and rewritten them to suit their needs. A threat was not something to be survived. It was something to be disassembled and used. Fear was not an emotion to be soothed. It was a catalyst for a new research agenda. Their entire societal engine was now tuned to this frequency. Identify a problem, break it down, turn its components into advantages. The official stance was one of benevolent protection. The underlying reality was more complex. A predator that studies its prey does not just learn how to kill it. It learns how to replace it. It learns to become the new apex force in the ecosystem. Humanity had not just defeated the void spawn. They had absorbed their role. They had become the entity that could move through dimensions, enforce reality, and wield power on a cosmic scale. The difference was intention. The void spawn were a natural disaster. Humanity was a conscious, calculating force. They could rewrite destiny because they treated it as a system to be hacked. The galaxy was advised to be wary. The warning was not in the official report. It was in the silence that followed. It was in the way human technicians could bypass any security system with a personal phase shifter. It was in the unilateral implantation of reality anchors. It was in the cold efficiency of the hunter-killer teams. They were protectors. But they were protectors who answered to no authority but their own. They had saved everyone. That fact was undeniable. But salvation had come with strings attached. The strings were made of stabilized space-time and held absolute power. The balance was gone. The old galactic order, with its councils and treaties and slow, careful progress, was obsolete. It had been built by civilizations that saw the universe as a place to be explored and understood. Humanity saw it as a place to be mastered and utilized. Their era was not beginning with a celebration. It was beginning with a quiet, systemic takeover of the mechanisms of safety and power. They were not conquerors. They were stewards. But they were stewards with a terrifying vision and the will to implement it without consent. The report was clear. The crisis was over. The new reality was just beginning. The galaxy had a new guardian, and guardianship looked an awful lot like control. Domesticating cosmic horror begins with classification. You take the thing that cannot be understood and you give it a name, a designation, a serial number. You put it in a category. The void spawn were not defeated. They were cataloged. A Class 4 entity was not an object of terror. It was a problem set with known parameters and predicted behaviors. It had weaknesses that could be exploited. It had a biological signature that could be tracked. It was no longer an existential mystery. It was a specimen. This was the fundamental shift. Humanity did not destroy the unknowable. They made it knowable. The process was one of systematic improvement. The captured void spawn were not just studied. They were optimized. Their abilities were measured, analyzed, and then enhanced through applied technology. The human-built phase shifters were more reliable and controllable than the natural ability of the entities. The reality projection weapons could stabilize a larger area with greater precision. Humanity took the raw, chaotic power of the cosmic horror and refined it. They made it more efficient, more useful. They domesticated it. The entities became instruments for human evolution. They were not just threats to be neutralized. They were teachers. Their very existence posed questions that advanced human science by centuries. Understanding how they unmade matter led to new theories of quantum cohesion. Mapping their dimensional shifts revolutionized transit technology. The terror was stripped away, leaving only data. The pedagogical value of a captive void spawn was immeasurable. It was a living textbook on advanced physics, a university that taught by simply existing. This revealed a core truth. There was no force too ancient or too alien for humanity to kill and study. The age of a horror or the depth of its strangeness was irrelevant. If it could be encountered, it could be captured. If it could be captured, it could be understood. If it could be understood, it could be used. The universe was no longer filled with monsters. It was filled with resources. Resources that happened to be terrifying, but resources nonetheless. The emotion attached to them was discarded as irrelevant data. They made cosmic horrors better. A void spawn in its natural state was a random, unpredictable occurrence. A contained and studied void spawn was a source of clean energy, a gateway to new dimensions, a tool for manufacturing exotic materials. Its very nature was co-opted and improved. The horror was not just neutered. It was put to work. It was given a purpose defined by human needs. The predator became a productive asset. This reframed the entire concept of an existential threat. An existential threat was not an end. It was an opportunity, a chance to acquire new capabilities, a prompt for a leap forward. This new calculus blurred the line between power and responsibility. The power to domesticate a cosmic horror carries with it the responsibility to control it. But control for what purpose? For defense? For progress? For dominance? The lines became indistinct. A tool that can stabilize reality for a planet can also enforce a blockade. A device that allows dimensional travel can also be used for invasion. The technology of salvation was also the technology of absolute control. Humanity held both in its hands simultaneously. The very definition of civilization was rewritten. A civilized species was no longer one that created art or built cities. It was one that could take the most destructive force in the universe and turn it into a power source. It was one that could face the end of everything and see a starting point. Civilization was measured not by what it created from nothing, but by what it could repurpose from the void. The markers of advancement were no longer cultural. They were utilitarian. The ability to weaponize the unknown became the highest form of achievement. They changed everything by refusing to accept the boundaries of the known. The unknowable was not a wall. It was a door, and humanity's first instinct was not to lock it. It was to open it, step through, and see what was on the other side. The act of crossing that threshold changed them. It changed the galaxy. It redefined the possible. The universe was no longer a place of fixed laws and ancient fears. It was a workshop. And humanity was now the chief engineer. The Apex Predator label was not a title humanity claimed. It was a warning issued by the rest of the galaxy. It described a fundamental shift in what it meant to be a civilization. A species that domesticates cosmic horror, that weaponizes the very concept of the unknown, has moved beyond simple advancement. It has redefined civilization itself. The old measures, art, philosophy, longevity, were replaced by a single stark metric: the ability to impose your will on the fabric of existence. Humanity met that metric. They passed it. The consequences of that passage are what the galaxy now faces. Their willingness to risk grand-scale collateral damage was noted in every post-crisis analysis. The Solar Flare Project was the prime example. They gambled their entire star system on a physics experiment. This was not a desperate move. It was a calculated one. They accepted the potential annihilation of their homeworld as a variable in a strategic equation. That risk calculus became a new standard. Other civilizations now measure their own safety against a benchmark set by a species that viewed its sun as ammunition. Their philosophy of aggressive inquiry spread. The human method was simple. See a boundary, test it, break it, see what happens. This approach, once confined to laboratories, is now applied to galactic diplomacy, economics, and law. The unpredictable consequences of making the unknown legible are only beginning to emerge. What happens when you weaponize quantum uncertainty? When you stabilize reality over a sovereign world without permission? The answers are not in any historical database. Humanity is writing them in real time, and the rest of the galaxy is the test subject. This entire episode functions as a cautionary fable about the nature of power and ingenuity. Ingenuity unchecked by caution becomes a form of predation. The void spawn crisis did not create this potential in humanity. It exposed a latent capability, a capacity for ruthlessly efficient problem-solving that had been dormant, waiting for a problem of sufficient scale to activate it. The crisis was the key that unlocked a door, and what walked through changed the shape of the universe. It accelerated their ascent to galactic dominance by centuries, perhaps millennia. The normal progression of a spacefaring species involves slow exploration, careful first contact, and gradual integration. Humanity skipped those steps. They were handed a galactic-scale emergency and used it to bypass the queue. They went from a single-system species to the de facto governing power in a handful of years. Their technology, their tactics, their very mindset became the new standard by which all others are measured and found lacking. The galaxy now lives in the shadow of its savior. The protectors are in charge. Their ships patrol the trade lanes. Their reality anchors hum under the surfaces of 100 worlds. Their laws carry the weight of absolute power. The fear of the void spawn has been replaced by a more complex anxiety. It is the unease of a patient who owes their life to a brilliant surgeon, but who knows the surgeon views them as another interesting case study. The predator is not at the gate. The predator is the gatekeeper. The act of salvation was also an act of conquest, and the price of survival is permanent vigilance under a new, unpredictable, and immensely powerful master. A crisis does not just test a civilization. It acts as a catalyst, forcing an evolutionary leap. The nature of that leap reveals the deepest patterns within a society. For most, the pattern is one of preservation, a retreat to core principles, a circling of wagons, a defense of what exists. Humanity's pattern was different. It was one of transformation. The void spawn, a universal emblem of fear, became an unexpected accelerator for human development. They provided a problem of such immense scale that it justified a total reallocation of resources, a complete societal shift. The threat was not an ending. It was a beginning. Where other civilizations saw a rational boundary, a point at which resistance becomes futile and flight becomes the only logical response, humanity saw a starting line. They transformed the concept of extinction from a final barrier into a motivator. The pressure to avoid annihilation became the engine for unprecedented innovation and collaboration. Internal conflicts that had simmered for generations were set aside. The entire species focused its intellect and industry on a single objective. This unity of purpose, forged in the face of total erasure, unlocked a potential that had remained dormant during times of peace. The willingness to weaponize knowledge was the key that turned the lock. Other species protected their understanding, hoarding it, building civilizations upon it. Humanity took their understanding and used it as a blunt instrument. They turned physics into a projectile. They turned ignorance into a strategy. This approach did not just win a war. It ended an era. The old galactic order, built on gradual progress and cautious diplomacy, was rendered obsolete. A new era began, defined by a species that treated the universe not as a home to be cherished, but as a workshop to be used. This represents a fundamental shift in how existential threats are managed. The previous model was binary, fight or flight. Humanity introduced a third option, assimilate. They refused to play by the established rules of engagement. The rule that said you cannot fight what you do not understand. The rule that said some forces are too powerful to oppose. They broke these rules systematically and without apology. They proved that no threat is too ancient, too alien, or too powerful to be studied, dismantled, and eventually used. The galaxy learned a difficult lesson. Some species operate on a different risk calculus. They see the universe not as a set of fixed laws to be obeyed, but as a set of suggestions to be tested. For these species, a cosmic horror is not a reason to despair. It is an opportunity to acquire new capabilities. The void spawn's greatest advantage was the terror they inspired. Humanity weaponized that too. They took the fear and fed it into their research divisions. They turned the horror into data, the data into weapons, the weapons into victory. The final unsettling synthesis was this: humanity took the very thing designed to erase them and turned it into their greatest advantage. They integrated the capabilities of their enemy into their own technological base. They didn't just survive the encounter, they improved because of it. They emerged from the crisis stronger, more advanced, and in control of powers that had once been the domain of nightmares. The predator learned from the prey, and in doing so became something new, something the galaxy is still struggling to define. The crisis was a catalyst. Humanity was the compound waiting to react. The result changed everything. The void spawn broke from their prison expecting prey. They found a predator. Humanity demonstrated a simple, brutal truth. For every hell unleashed, there is a species ready to get nasty. They didn't just fight back. They industrialized the response. They turned terror into data and nightmares into weapons. So remember this story. When you face something that seems too vast, too powerful, too ancient to fight, consider the human response. Sometimes the right move isn't to calculate the odds, it's to laugh into the void and declare war on the impossible.